Welcome to our latest edition of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. We're really lucky to be joined today by Dr. Jeffrey DeMarco, who's a forensic psychologist, criminologist, and legal researcher. So you can see why we wanted him on, because he's got such a range of skills. He works in criminal justice consultancy, providing consultancy on, among other things, online child sexual abuse, exploitation, violent extremism, and homicide. He's worked to reduce online sexual abuse, and in particular the intersection between psychology and technology. He's a wide range of experience lecturing at Bucks University with our friend Kieran O'Keefe, and the Royal Holloway and Middlesex University, to name a few. So I wondered if you could tell us, Jeff, a bit about how you got into your current role and how your career developed.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you both for having me and giving me the opportunity to discuss and share my passion and my interest in the field of forensic psychology. So my current role, which is working as a senior associate with Victim Support National Homicide Service, started after leaving a policy think tank, the National Center for Social Research, where I had done a lot of work on a range of forms of criminality, mostly violent extremism and child sexual abuse, really working closely with government agencies and trying to understand the threats of those problems and how we could improve responses, interventions, and prevention. This role brought me into a knowledge and insight function where I was responsible for comms, for external affairs, and our research data and reporting, and ultimately working with the National Homicide Service in the mobilization and implementation of our offer of support, which is to all those that are bereaved by homicide across England and Wales, as well as those that are bereaved abroad that are British citizens. The passion really started years ago in my formative youth. My grandmother was a voracious reader, and she always made sure us grandchildren read a plethora of different types of books. She got me onto crime novels, the typical airport type James Patterson. I became fascinated by an individual, fictional character to be very clear, named Dr. Detective Alex Cross. And for the last 30 years, I've been reading those books. I get them for Christmas every year, and it really kind of made me want to understand more the modus operandi, motivations, and thinking behind why criminals do what they do and how we can respond as a society.
Love that as an answer. That was really cool. Maybe like in time, James Patterson might write a book about you.
That would be fantastic. I do know Amazon Prime is currently creating a series. So, I mean, perhaps I can add one of those feathers to my hat and get my acting career into gear.
Amazon Prime, if you are watching, this is your man, okay? One of the questions that we ask all our guests is kind of like how practically they became who they are now. So like, what kind of route did you go into? What did you learn? What did you go to uni? We've got lots of people on who watch us that want to know about routes into psychology. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I went to a Canadian university, McGill University, to do my undergraduate. Had a fantastic and fascinating 4 years there where I did a bachelor's of science. My major was in psychology, and my minor was in chemistry. The intention was to possibly pursue a medical career, so thinking around forensic pathology or psychiatry. But, the 4-year undergraduate gave me time to think and go through the trials and tribulations of what worked for me and what I felt less comfortable with. I came to the conclusion of those 4 years and wasn't quite certain what I wanted to do yet, but I knew that I had a passion for crime and justice and for the world of forensics. So I did a year doing the equivalent of a postgraduate diploma. It's not quite the same thing in North America, but it let me do a year kind of more general around forensic sciences. So entomology, a little bit more psychology, some criminology, some law, but also kind of blood splatter analysis and chemistry. And again, just really kind of feeling whether I could take that psychology element, but in a more practical sense. So not that psychology isn't a practical discipline, but actually looking at the nitty gritty and the granularity, if you will, of that investigative process. Really enjoyed what I learned that year. Thought a lot about my future trajectories. Applied to do a master's program both in the UK and in the United States. was accepted at London Metropolitan in London, obviously, at the UK, as well as John Jay in the US. And I decided that I was going to pursue the European adventure. And lo and behold, did my MSc in forensic psychology, and was going to go back home, was going to move back to Canada. And eventually during those years in the masters, I had some great experiences. I did some research work actually at the time with Kieran O'Keefe and looking at police interviewing techniques of terrorism act offenders. As well as a little bit more work around kind of witness lineups, eyewitnessing. And as I was contemplating moving back, one of my lecturers had suggested I get in contact with some of her colleagues at Royal Holloway, in which I did, and then was offered a doctoral program and did my doctorate at Royal Holloway. And the rest kind of writes itself over the course of the doctorate. I probably took too much other things on the side. I did do my doctorate full time, but also worked full time, doing some research here, some policy stuff here, a bit of psychological work as a trainee with some colleagues and some ex-colleagues. Got to the end of the doctorate and went in to do a postdoctoral research fellowship at Middlesex University. And that was very much in online harms and child sexual abuse and exploitation, where we did a lot of work with the European Commission and Europol. And yeah, that was it. That was the educational pathway. The rest kind of just gravitated into the experiences I'd picked up along the way and tried to turn those into areas of my own expertise and specialism, and built on some basic research, some basic consultancy work, and, continued the networks and went into partnerships with other individuals to ensure that we could advance the fields in those areas that I really worked hard in.
Wow.
It really demonstrates how, when we do our core competencies to qualify as a psychologist, how you can develop all of those roles and carry on doing all of those different strands, because we usually enjoy all of them. Some people don't like one particular part or another, but generally we do like them all. So it's nice to be able to practice all of the things you've learned, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And it makes me, I often use the cliche term pracademic because I don't quite sit in academia.
Yeah.
I do sit as the deputy director for the Center of Abuse and Trauma Studies, which is at Middlesex University in the psychology department. There I have a few grants, a few PhD students. I do a bit of teaching on our clinical program for trauma-informed practice and interventions and prevention. But I also, as I mentioned, work for the National Homicide Service. Before that was within the wider National Victim Support. And I've really enjoyed the policy strands, really enjoyed using my experience, my knowledge, the things I've learned around the way, and being quite humble to learn along the way to inform policy and practice. And not just with, big government ministries and departments, but also with other third sector organizations and partners, with police forces, with probation and prisons, and also kind of in the whole, taking it back to brass tacks, I suppose, in psychology. Have loved some of the work I've done over the years in informing new risk assessments that will be applied and administered within HMPPS or within any, other secure settings, to make sure that we're doing the right things, we're assessing risk appropriately, we're identifying needs, and we're monitoring for responsivity and making sure that we are working towards rehabilitation and non-stigmatizing practices. And it's something that I really, really love. So I do yearly provide a few lectures for the MSc in forensics at Royal Holloway. And one of the things I hope that they really benefit from is, beyond just my practice and my research background, is getting them to think a little bit more around policy and policy recommendations, and how their work and their learning and the gaps and the challenges, everything doesn't need to be a success, can really be useful both to their own organizations and to wider ministries and departments within government in changing how we function in the wider criminal space.
Mm-hmm. That's really important. And lots of people ask us the difference between a criminologist and a forensic psychologist as well. That's a very popular question.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's one I get a lot of, especially when you start to see kind of different courses out there, BScs, BAs, MScs, MAs, kind of like forensic psychology, psychology with criminology, criminology with psychology.
Criminal psychology.
Well, precisely. And the way I often describe it is that criminology in its purest sense focuses on that intersection between sociology and crime. So how social constructs, how social factors interact with either a desire to engage or motivation to engage in criminality, but also desistance and not getting drawn into criminality. Whereas psychology very much is, and bear with me here, person-centric. So it's around that individual. Obviously, the individual lives within a larger ecosystem of social constructs, those interactions with other people, other institutions, other facts. So, I mean, there is an overlap there where we start to delve into those social influences. But for me, again, that psychological bit is around the person. It's around those people, whether they're victims, whether they're police officers, whether they're perpetrators or alleged perpetrators. It's around understanding kind of their pathway in, their maintenance through, and their desistance, if possible, from. And I do say victims, police, and other individuals because in my mind, forensic psychology isn't just about perpetrators, offenders, and alleged perpetrators. It's about, again, the intersection with the human being and that legal system and legal infrastructure.
Mm.
I think we need to like cut that explanation, and then you can be ready to go whenever anyone asks. It gets like you get asked it a lot, don't you? Lots of people ask what's the difference, and I'm always sort of a bit waffly about it. Now maybe I'll just cut it and I can just hit play. Ready to go.
Out and show it.
Let's hope the sociologists and criminologists agree with me.
Okay. Well, if anyone's listening and they don't, I'm sure they're going to tell you. So I understand that you two met on, and I want to get this word right, there's too many acronyms in the world. Am I saying NOTA?
Yeah.
So you recently met on the NOTA Research Committee. Can you tell us a little bit about what NOTA is, what your role is there, what does the committee do?
Yeah, of course. So I'm relatively new. I've had the honor of being invited to sit on the NOTA Research Committee. We've had one meeting so far. So the organization as a whole, and Jerry, you are much more experienced with probably explaining this than I am. So do fill in where I'm wrong. But it essentially is a third sector organization that brings together professionals, practitioners, organizations that work towards the treatment of abuse, and whether that's specifically of victims and survivors, but also those that may have gotten drawn into antisocial behavior, criminality, or offending, and it's understanding about kind of the duty of care and service to them, but also making sure that we have a high standard and level of practice when working with individuals that have experienced different types of abuse. The research committee
tend to focus on sexual abuse.
Yes, that's right, and that's essentially what got my attention to NOTA, was my background in having worked in the area of child sexual abuse and online child sexual abuse and exploitation, as well as having done a big piece of work a few years ago around significant influencers when it comes to child sexual abuse. And the idea there is who are the people, and what are the symbols or essentially constructs in the society that positively and negatively influence individuals that may be drawn into committing a form of sexual abuse. And by positive, I mean working as reinforcing them not to want to offend or not to act on their urges, I should say, or motivate them, but equally negative influences, things that might cause them or make them feel as if they need to offend or they want to act on their needs, if you will. So the research committee, so I'd been in contact with a few individuals across the organization, and I was introduced to the research committee. And I suppose at the research committee, what we do is we come together from a range of disciplines, so practitioner-based, policy-based, practicing-based, academic-based, to kind of think about what it is we want for NOTA, what we want to do in terms of evaluating the organization as a whole, but also looking at emerging and good practice out there in treating abuse and sexual abuse and how practitioners are operating, but also in kind of identifying those gaps. Where is work not being done? Where could skill acquisition be built up? And what can we as an organization or we as a committee do to kind of help facilitate that, but also try and kind of encourage an appetite of doing research in, what I'll say, quite frankly, having worked in the area of child sexual abuse for quite some time, can be perceived as quite an unpalatable area to work in. A lot of the work and a lot of my own research in the past, especially with practitioners and with perpetrators and alleged perpetrators, demonstrates a a level of a lack of comfort in doing work and spending resource on individuals that are perceived to have a sexual interest in children.
And I think what you said early on about victims is really important, because I think people often think or say to us, why do you choose to do that rather than help victims? And I always say that's what I'm doing it for, is to prevent victims. But I think people don't necessarily see the connection, or also see that lots of the people in prison are also victims. And so, there is a big sort of overlap in those areas as well. But it's definitely something people don't necessarily think about. And I think when people think about people in prison in that way, they're more likely to have some sort of feelings, more positive feelings towards them, rather than lock them up and throw away the key.
Well, I completely agree, and you hit the nail on the head there. There's I use this generic nebulous term called the wider harms theory around how actually there are wider risk factors out there that make a multitude of individuals vulnerable to a plethora of different pathways into victimization and into criminality. And when you look specifically at child sexual abuse and the work I've done, the outcome of being abused oneself and having had a multitude of those adverse childhood experiences could be you yourself are sexually abused, and that can then also transform into, well, that is a risk factor for your own perpetration at another point in your life. And it's understanding that it's not black and white. Perpetration and victimization in certain areas is not black and white. The outcome can very much be that you end up perpetrating. And it's not, doing any kind of victim blaming, and it's not making allowances for the perpetration. I tell a lot of my clinical students, a contravention, the most basic definition of a crime is contravention of the criminal law, right? So if you have broken the law, you've broken the law, regardless of those facts and those risk factors that might be in place. However, that doesn't mean that we throw away the key. There's an importance in rehabilitation. There's an importance in an approach towards being non-stigmatizing and trying to be restorative and to reintegrate individuals post-offense. But also, Jerry, on that side of it, some perpetrators have experienced this pathway in their own victimization. Like you say, working with individuals across that shape of crime. It's not just working with perpetrators or victims. You can work across the pillars and inform practice on both sides, and other sides inform practice on how third sector organizations like victim support work, inform practice in how government forges policy and legislation, and inform practice on how the police operate.
Yeah, and I think again, that's the thing people wouldn't necessarily think about, working with the third sector and charities to help inform them about what are the risks. So there's lots of really good charities out there like NOTA or the Lucy Faithful or Safer Living Foundation that are all working towards trying to support people to prevent offending. So it's thinking about how we can help them to further their work.
That's making sure everyone's aware of the toolkit of resources at their disposal, right? It doesn't, everything doesn't need to be a, structured judgment and a punitive response. There are other ways that individuals, you think about some of the charities you just noted, and I'll use the Lucy Faithful as a really good example. I think they do fantastic work, and you look at other more social welfarist countries or political economies such as Germany or Scandinavia, who have a somewhat more successful approach in tackling sexual abuse because it is in the public discourse. The public are aware at perhaps a more significant level than here or perhaps other Western nations. So there is a dialogue. And I think that dialogue is very important, because that dialogue and that level of awareness means that individuals that might be worried about their thoughts, might be worried about how those thoughts might translate into actions, will possibly be more empowered to seek the support and help they might need. Whereas if we treat it quite stigmatizing, if we treat it in an unpalatable way, then it's very unlikely people are going to come forward.
And how did you get into your international role? You talked about the national homicide and working internationally. How did that come about?
Yeah, that's a lot of that stuff just happened by chance, I'll say. I mean, I say chance, but it was perhaps an eager and opportunistic and keen postgraduate student that wanted to work with some different groups and different peoples and translate my practice into other areas of the world that might not necessarily have that opportunity. So quite early on in my doctorate, I had the experience to travel to a lot of sub-Saharan Africa to work with police forces. So most of my doctoral research focused on vulnerable young people and how they got drawn into different forms of exploitation. So that includes sexual violence, but radicalization, gang violence, and trying to, again, look at commonality of risk factors, understanding that perhaps we don't need to recreate the wheel with every form of criminality, and that actually practitioners and other organizations could learn a lot from these different areas and disciplines and actually translate that, and then create bespoke practice as is necessary to meet the needs of the different clientele they were working at. But it very much kind of started with, going to sub-Saharan Africa, working with police force and working in helping them work with young people. So kind of applying some really basic principles of social psychology and intergroup contact. So, social psychology 101 for all the listeners is, when you have good positive conditions for contact across groups, most of the historical research was looking at kind of African Americans and white Americans and putting them into kind of areas where when there was no power differential, where there was a desire for cooperation and co-production, you actually saw decreased levels of prejudice, decreased levels of stigmatization, racism, and stereotypes. So it was applying some of those principles, but treating the out group, if you will, as these young people on the verge of criminality and antisocial behavior, and treating the in group as social institutions such as the police or an educational institution. So it was helping police train them up on being more youth-centric, more empathetic, more a larger desire to create a quote-unquote therapeutic alliance with the young people they were working in. So yes, there still is a power differential, but we don't want you on the streets, and we don't want you kind of committing these petty crimes or getting drawn into this criminality, and changing practice to kind of just help them have a little bit more of a willingness to cooperate and to work towards diversion and prevention. That evolved. I did similar, not identical, but similar work in some conflict zones. So working with militaries whilst they were in occupied territories, and working at how they could help build bonds with individuals and not automatically or essentially exasperate a radicalization process with those that might feel excluded. And again, trying to look at how they could co-produce, cooperate, how they could decrease that increase that therapeutic alliance, increase that rapport building, but decrease that animosity or perhaps division between them. And then during my postdoc, a lot of the networks and connections I'd made in kind of the global South and South Asia translated into a need for doing enhanced work in helping protect young people online. The UK is often seen as being one of the leading nations in tackling and protecting young people online, with organizations like the Internet Watch Foundation and CEOP Command at the National Crime Agency. With the new Online Safety Act, it's world changing, and actually we're one of the leading countries and leading authorities on how we can regulate and hold technology companies to account, but also keep people safe whilst not banning them from the internet. And because of the global nature of what I like to call the cyber psychological influences and the threat of online harms, I'm not going to just focus on sexual abuse, but a lot of my career did build off of that, involves having to go and work with companies and with police forces that work across borders, where a perpetrator may be in country A, the victim or survivor might be in country B, and the offense might be occurring through country C, but via country D. So really important to kind of try and harmonize and get people together and talking the same language to try and make our response and provide an intervention and prevention technique that actually is suitable for everyone.
Yeah, it's really important. And would you mind just saying what CEOP is, what it stands for?
Yeah, sorry. So the CEOP is the Center for Child Exploitation and Online Protection Center at the National Crime Agency.
Yeah.
So CEOP Command is the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Center.
Yeah. I remember a long time ago now, probably nearly 20 years ago, working in a prison where there was quite a number of people came into prison. I suppose it was sort of in its infancy then for having, there was a sort of particular operation within the police where they'd suddenly caught a lot of people who'd committed sexual offences via the internet by using their credit cards to pay for something. And then that was all, it was a big group of people came in, which were very different to the usual people that were in prison at that time. But the police officer we used to work with who was doing MAPA was talking about that they'd find an image of abuse. So they would they talked about they'd find an image of abuse, and then they would have to try and match the wallpaper or the curtains or the furnishings to see if that was current, and then where it was came from, or look for the type of plug in the room or something to try and identify, and I was thinking what a harrowing job that was to have to do that, identify the victim to see if it was still going on, and then if it was, or if they try to identify the person, then go to that person and tell them about that their image was online, and how harrowing that would be to find out your image is online and you can never take it off. And so not only have you been sexually abused, but it's out there for people to see. And that was always a sort of a thing that stuck with me. And it was very difficult at that time to work out how to help increase the victim empathy of people who committed that type of offence, because their defence, I suppose, was always to say, well, I didn't actually do it. I just bought the images. I didn't, I didn't ask for the abuse to happen. I just bought the images that were there. So one of the ways we would try to see it was to look at it from the police officer's point of view of having to, this police officer told us. There's often you talk to people like the police and they'll tell you quite harrowing stories. It's almost like they've never had anyone to talk to about it. But what that was like, literally walking up the path to somebody and changing their life in that way. And that sort of feeling, would it be better not to tell them? That sort of thing, maybe I shouldn't tell them and I won't tell them. It's this terrible decision to have to make, and then to have to inform the person, and then how that person might then go on holiday anywhere in the world and be recognised by somebody who's seen those images. So it was always a very sort of, I think, things people don't think about when they click onto those sorts of images, really, the impact that has long term on the victims of what's used to be called child pornography, when it's clearly images of child's being abused, and just the how that they're out there forever and they can't be sort of taken back.
No, it's a really good point, and kind of there's two sides to that, I suppose. You make a really strong point around the kind of the police and kind of the individuals that have to look at that content themselves to keep people safe. And so one of the projects I'm leading on right now is developing a psychoeducational self-help tool for commercial content moderators. So that's the people that all around the world are responsible for trying to keep content like that off of our platforms, off of the social media, accounts that we have, but they get very, very little support and very little help. And they're very much stuck in an echo chamber where they can speak to each other, but it's perceived to be part of their job. Very similar to what you hear in terms of police psychology around, you're a police officer, get on with the job sometimes. We've come a long way, I think, over the last 20, 30 years, but you still do hear that talk a lot. The other side of it, Jerry, which we did a little bit of work with Europol a few years ago, was exactly that, around the knowledge of that image or that video being out there still. And we've tried to move towards a narrative of every time that image or video is viewed, that is another experience of victimization. And therefore, your generation or the generation of one image or one video of you isn't a single event. It's going to possibly be looked at by thousands, if not, hundreds of thousands of people across the globe. And the psychological impact, the weight of knowledge on an individual for knowing that at any given time, there may be individuals out there looking at that is quite unknown. It's quite unknown. Hence why we did a bit of this work. What we identified out of that was, indicators of PTSD, indicators of major depressive disorder, indicators of general anxiety disorder, but also kind of, facilitators into harmful offline sexual behaviors after having experienced this in their formative years. And I suppose kind of that's one of my primary messages with my online safety hat on is, and it's a slogan I try and use with a lot of the work I do right now, is there is life after the pic. There is life after the pic. And it's having meaningful and realistic conversations with people around, yeah, this is challenging. This is going to be challenging. It's going to hurt. It's going to be embarrassing. It's going to lead to some negative outcomes, but you're going to be okay. And there is support for you, and there are people to talk to, and there are things we can do.
If there are people watching or listening and they are identifying with some of the things that you're saying, is there places that you would point people, obviously, to their loved ones and their family members, but are there helplines or charities that people could talk to if they're listening to this now and don't know where to go?
Yeah, of course. I would always urge any young person that may have experienced online child sexual abuse to contact Childline at the NSPCC, or to contact victim support. We have a toll-free number. We also have a live chat. We have a fantastic set of sexual violence practitioners, as well as CYP, specific sexual violence practitioners. By CYP, I mean children and young people. So we're always happy to kind of, there's no judgment. For us, again, a crime is a crime is a crime. Victimization and survivorship is what it is. We'll be there for you to provide kind of practical support, emotional support, and help you navigate that system, whether or not you want to go through the formal criminal justice process. So that's explicitly true with us at Victim Support. We very much, we will, if you are interested in going through a police process and going down that path, we'll very much help you navigate that. But equally, that's not part of what we're there for. We're there for you. We're there for your help. The other thing to say, though, kind of in terms of support, is it's okay to talk about it. You're allowed to be embarrassed. You're allowed to feel shameful. You see a lot of gendered lines in the online child sexual abuse space, where we see a lot of young women in particular who are reluctant to come forward because of things like slut shaming, and they deserved it. And they obviously, all the rape myths and sexual violence myths come into that, which they absolutely shouldn't. And with the boys, you get a number of issues around embarrassment. Often they think that, if everyone knows that they've been, they've created this image, they'll think that they were groomed by an older man, which is often the case with the young men in particular. It is often an older man posing as a younger woman who's trying to extort some money out of them, and then they don't want their friends to know that that's happened. They're also reluctant to come forward because often the young men see it as a badge of honor until they find out, until the gig is up and they find out that they've been groomed. So I suppose the whole point is parents and teachers need to have these conversations with young people, and they need to make a real safe, open space that kind of gets rid of the stigmatization of guilt, shame, embarrassment, and that just, be brutally honest. Yeah, it sucks a bit. Like it does. And what's happened to you is unfair, and it is a crime. And, there'll be some wobbles at the beginning, but actually you're going to be okay. There's people to talk to. Have those conversations. Don't go through this alone.
That's really important. And definitely important that, these are difficult things. And sometimes we hear people watching an episode of something, or watching a film, watching something like this, and memories that they've repressed, coming back. So it's really important to sort of talk to people and get the help that you need if that's happening to you, because, that, as you said, it's getting past this sort of feelings that those stigma that we shouldn't talk about these things, when obviously it's really important that you do, rather than carry that load on your own.
There's a really good piece of work out of CEOP right now called Send Me a Pic, which is for year 6 and 7s. And it's kind of turning all of this on its head, Jerry, which I think is trying to, again, make it less awkward to talk about sex. And instead of focusing on explicit images and child sexual abuse material and groomers, it's trying to reinforce messages about consent with the young people. And it's so it's not stigmatizing, it's understanding that there may be elements of digital romance here, and actually sharing pics and generating pics might be a current part of their formative psychosexual development. And what the Send Me a Pic educational resource does is tries and gets them to think about consent, make sure they're going through a decision-making process, make sure they're comfortable with what's being asked of them, make sure they understand what the repercussions could be. Now, this isn't going to be an overnight change, hence why I go back to the public health approach. It's going to take time, and it's going to take a generational shift, but it is trekking in the right direction, I think, making these conversations more palatable, more comfortable, and more in the open, so that it's not as awkward.
And I suppose, as you said about the different trajectories, as we're doing that at a time when children aren't thinking and making rational decisions. They're not, their brains aren't developed enough that they're going to think about the consequences of where those pictures are going to end up, or who they might be shared with. They're not in that position often, and often it is that sort of feeling of not feeling confident enough to say no when someone asks you to send that picture. So those are sort of the tricky things, aren't they, of how you get through to sort of to reach that audience, to talk, to have those discussions, really.
Well, absolutely, and you're spot on. Like, the technological evolution, or and adolescence is a perfect storm, isn't it? They're already going to be risky and impulsive, and not necessarily have fully functioning critical thinking skills and executive functioning, which is fine. I mean, I can raise my hand and said I was there once as well, as I'm sure all of our listeners have been. But you then give them the world at their fingertips. You then apply cyber psychological concepts like online disinhibition, anonymity, or perceptions of anonymity, perceptions of invisibility, the ability to be editable. Right? You bring some Rogers work in here and our ideal and real self. I can guarantee you every single one of your listeners, when they are texting a new romantic interest, they're not just saying what's coming out of their mouth right away. They're sitting there and rethinking exactly how they want to form their messages. That's not really who we are, is it? We're presenting ourselves as an ideal representation of who we want to be. So you put that all into the little petri dish. Of course, there's going to be some consequences, and of course, there's going to be some harm, and of course, there's going to be some accidents, and of course, there's going to be some negative kind of situations. It's about making sure we know what the risks are, and we ensure that there's resource and help available.
And so how do people, I mean, I guess our target audience is a bit older than this age group that we're sort of talking about at the moment, but what is available to keep people safe then in this area? Because I guess some of our students, some people might be thinking, even as they're getting a bit older, how they can be drawn into things without realizing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and like, you look at other forms of online harm, like online fraud, right? And everybody thinks it's older populations that are most at risk, but actually it's not. It's university students, to be honest with you, and it's those that are kind of in their early to mid 20s that are just a bit, perhaps after years of growing up with technology and instant gratification of technology. We don't necessarily do the right due diligence. So I suppose kind of, three core messages are that the UK Council for Internet Safety has a great website about internet safety, and it's not just about online child sexual exploitation. It's also around so-called revenge pornography, where images have been generated or shared in a consensual relationship, but those have then been transferred on without consent. There's also the revenge pornography helpline, which is really useful. Action Fraud does a lot of good work for those that might have been duped online through some kind of phishing scheme or any kind of fraud that might be able to help them get the support they need. Victim support, again, not just saying that because I work for them or have previously worked for the National Service. They offer a lot of good practitioners, and anybody that can self-refer in or can get advice. We also have self-help advice. So our support space gives individuals kind of different modules they can navigate, where they do reflective thinking. They kind of try some little they can try little techniques out to help if they're really suffering anxiety or fear following their experience of criminality. Or, there's a plethora of information available out there from organizations like the NSPCC, like CEOP Command, like Victim Support, like the Revenge Pornography Helpline, like Action Fraud, that can help you understand a little bit more about the 101s of staying safe online. I actually know as well that there's a lot of good resources and easy to use resources provided by the National Crime Agency more generally around preventing online harms to adult populations. questions, and it kind of has a whole bunch of little different resources around, are you susceptible to this kind of scam? Are you susceptible to this type of harm? And then based off of your kind of assessment and the things you put in, and they're not difficult assessments and they're not very intrusive, it kind of gives you some little self-help tips and guides around how you can keep yourself safe online. But also to remember, you know, if you have experienced a crime online, you can report it to the police. If the police feel that it is not a crime or that they cannot assist you, there are a whole bunch of organizations out there that will support you to get through what you've experienced, regardless of whether or not you follow the formal criminal justice process.
I feel like we could probably keep talking for 4 or 5 more hours, and but we don't have that kind of time, or you definitely don't. We've got so many other things that you are doing, which leads us on to our next question, our final question perhaps, around, you've already done so much, like you have conquered so much already. Is there anything that you haven't yet dipped your toe into, that you have dreams or aspirations to do? Like, what can we expect from you, other than obviously the Amazon Prime James Patterson?
No, Emily, it's a really good question, and yes, do watch out. I'll make sure that, you know, once I'm casted into a recurring role on the program, I let you know, and I come
Thank
back
you.
with
Yeah,
different
we'd like a shout out.
Tell us how it works.
Yeah, yeah.
There's 2 passions of mine. I mentioned a bit earlier that I've been working with a funder named Safe Online, who are trying to make the world a safer place for people online, and that we've been building this work with commercial content moderators. Years 1 and 2 of the study, we're creating a proof of concept, so how we could create a self-help tool that would kind of assess their needs from looking at harmful content and provide both them with some psychoeducation and tasks to engage in that might help them manage their intrusive thoughts or their feelings of helplessness, but also try and inform middle and senior management within the technology industry around what this might mean to team morale and team efficiencies. The second bit, which is briefer, is a lot of my work has kind of run in parallel, looking at the radicalization process and the child sexual abuse grooming process. And I'm very fascinated in the overlap between the two. I mentioned a bit earlier, Jerry, around kind of the wider harms agenda and how actually outcomes, similar risk and vulnerability may lead to different outcomes, but actually it could be similar cognitive and behavioral processes. And I've done quite a bit of research looking at how the radicalization and grooming process actually cognitively and behaviorally are quite similar. And I'm very keen to do some additional non-pilot based work. I've done some anecdotal and case study work looking at the overlap between actual Terrorism Act offenders and their engagement with child sexual abuse material. And I'm very keen to delve into that more, because again, that group of individuals are going to have a very, very specific set of needs. And I don't think current rehabilitation plans for them is necessarily fit for purpose.
And definitely also people, young men particularly going in, and women going into gangs, are being groomed by older people into gangs, and then sometimes, you know, recording sexual incidents against them as a way of keeping them into the gangs, is a bit like an initiation. And again, I think when they begin to realise that that's what's happened to them, they've, you know, that sort of the shame associated with being groomed, but also with being having committed a sexual offence in that way, really gets in the way of people being able to sort of see what the risks of that are. So I can see lots of overlap with that, with the extremism as well, of not being wanted to fall into that category of offender. They'd much rather want to be a person that commits violence rather than sexual offending. It's been fascinating talking to you. I really appreciate you giving up your time to speak to us, and I think really demonstrating for people the range of opportunities there are in forensic psychology, and we really appreciate you talking to us. And just remains for us to say, let's talk forensic psychology.